Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. To ask that Hollywood be faithful in depicting historical events is like asking that a fish prove its earnestness by riding a bicycle. A futile hope. And so it is with The Woman King, directed by Gina Prince-Bytherwood, and with the inimitable Viola Davis in the starring role. And yet, despite all its distortions, the film did strike an unerring note about the complex historical transition that the Kingdom of Dahomey, in today's Benin, was going through in the period in which it was set. The real King Gezu, superbly played in the film by John Boyega, reigned from 1818 to 1859. The film itself starts in 1823. The dates are significant partly because they come a good length of time after the British abolition of slavery in 1807. Slave emancipation in the British Empire was to come in 1833, while France's decree was made in 1848. Slavery was abolished much later in Spanish Cuba in 1886 and in Portuguese Brazil in 1888. From 1808, the British set up a naval patrol known as the West African Squadron, also called the Preventative Squadron, to patrol the Atlantic along the Gulf of Guinea and to seize slave ships and free their cargoes of slaves. Many freed slaves were sent to Freetown in Sierra Leone, where they were met by Christian missionaries and conversion. But most significant in this film was the presence of the Portuguese in 1823 at Ouidah, who were shown happily continuing with the slave trade. Why did this occur in the period so clearly after abolition? The continuing Portuguese slave trade in the region comes from a very pragmatic and indeed cynical treaty that the British signed with Portugal in 1810. That allowed the latter to exclusively continue with their slave trading in certain named ports, one of which was Ouidah. The treaty, also known as the Strangford Treaty, was signed between Britain and the Portuguese royal family, which was living in exile in Brazil following Napoleon's invasion of Portugal in 1807. Portugal's royal family had managed their escape with the help of the British Navy. Signed in Rio de Janeiro, the treaty gave Great Britain significant commercial advantages, including preferential tariffs on its goods arriving in Brazil, in recompense for the British defense of the Portuguese crown during the Napoleonic Wars. The treaty represented Britain's gradualist approach to ending the trade, specifically in relation to their Portuguese allies, something that might be said to have offset advantages accruing from the Slave Abolition Act of 1807. The British were to stop the slave trade from Dahomey finally in 1852 with a massive naval blockade. But the Portuguese had been in West Africa and trading since 1414, first arriving in Capo Verde, but then moving to establish settlements all over West Africa, and indeed even down to the Cape in South Africa. The fort in the movie is likely referencing Fort of São João Baptista de Ajuda, which the Portuguese built at Ouidah in 1721, even though trading had started in that area on their first arrival in 1580. The Portuguese had introduced a Portuguese-inflected pidgin as a trade language all across their holdings in West Africa and beyond. We will dedicate a future episode to this aspect of the Portuguese interactions with West Africans. The language that Kingezu is seen speaking with the Portuguese merchants in the movie was likely a variant of this pidgin. But the historical Kingezu was also known to have written many letters to the King of Portugal at the time, suggesting that he was a man who strategized well beyond his own kingdom. Also important in the film were the references to palm oil production as well as to indigo. After slave abolition, the attempt to switch from slave economies to what historians of the period referred to as legitimate trade meant that many West African societies adopted palm oil production. This proved highly lucrative until the early part of the 20th century, as palm oil and related products were central for fueling the Industrial Revolution. The history of indigo in West Africa is a bit more complicated, but suffice it to say that the film made a good point of showing the indigenous garment production industry that was present in the period. The uniforms that the Agoji wore to war were different from the fabrics that they wore in peacetime at home. Both fabrics were locally woven and dyed with indigo and other natural dyes. It is the introduction of factory woven cotton that ultimately displaced the locally woven fabrics in West Africa and converted them either into peasant wear or highly ceremonial clothing. As in Ghana, for example, there is a sharp contrast to be drawn between the batakari, a variant of the Agoji war dress in the film, which is typically associated with the north of the country, and vlisco, on the other hand, more popularly known as African print cloth. This is, of course, a complete misnomer. Originally established by the Dutch in 1848, vlisco represents the European takeover and indeed almost complete displacement of what Simon Gikandi refers to as a culture of taste that had developed for generations around indigenous African garments. One significant detail regarding the clothes that the people wore in the film, and which was also important as the marker of historical processes, is that it was not always that the fabrics of King Gezu's beautiful gowns, and indeed those of his favorite wife, were made of the same fabric as those of the people over whom he ruled. At several points, his beautiful gowns were made of silk, clearly imported from elsewhere. This is also historically accurate, since the political elites and their satellite traders were the first to adopt items of European material culture, including fabrics, garments, cooking utensils, candle holders, guns, and of course, a new range of alcoholic beverages. Whiskey is also mentioned more than once in the film. It is not clear what exactly the Portuguese merchants Santo Ferreira and Malik brought to King Gezu when they came to pay homage to him in the film, but we can be sure that the large wooden chest that they brought with them must have contained various European goods. Perhaps the most important element of historical salience, however, was the internal debates that were depicted in the film regarding the usefulness or otherwise of the trade in slaves. These debates had been raging consistently since well before the age of Gezu. What the film shows is the merging of contradictory historical impulses. On the one hand, represented by the rapacious Portuguese slave traders at Ouidah, and on the other, the factional internal disagreements within the Dahomey kingdom itself. The film depicts the Agoji as the historical agents of anti-slavery, but the truth was a bit more complicated, since some of those they conscripted into their ranks were also enslaved women. The historical vicissitudes of the period were highly complex. The historical Agoji, sometimes also called Ahosi or King's Wives, were a fearsome all-female military regiment of the Dahomey Kingdom and were often referred to as Dahomey Amazons in European sources. King Huigbaja, third king of Dahomey, who ruled from 1645 to 1685, is credited with starting a military group that would then become a corps of elephant hunters. The significance of hunter groups was that they gathered immense know-how about the surrounding landscapes to settlements, and thus were very important in establishing war and defense strategies. Later, Huigbaja's daughter, Queen Hangbe, who ruled from 1716 to 1718, founded an all-female troop of bodyguards. Tradition has it that her brother and successor, King Agaja, then used them successfully in wars that Dahomey fought with its neighbors in 1727. The era of King Gezu was one of increased militarization of Dahomey when wars with the Oyo peaked, and there were also a constant threat from the Europeans on the coast. The Agoji were recruited from free Dahomeyan women, as well as the extensive group of kings' wives. And as we see in the film, some of the recruitment was also done via slave raiding, as the Dahomey Kingdom was for a long time central to the transatlantic slave trade and built much of its wealth from it. Estimated that by the time of King Gezu, the Agoji numbered several thousand members and a full third of the entire Dahomey army. Also of historical interest in the woman king is the way in which the soldiers from Oyo were dressed. At the time, parts of Yoruba land, which the term Oyo in the movie was supposed to cover, had been overrun by Muslim armies from northern Nigeria, inspired southwards most famously by Uthman Danfodio. The Yoruba kingdom of Ilorin had become Islamicized by the 18th century and became the military headquarters of the Oyo kingdom by the start of the 19th century, so that the depiction in the movie of the soldiers from Oyo wearing turbans and riding horses was a direct reference to the place of Islam among the Yoruba in the period. However, the implied opposition established in the movie between horse riders, which is the Oyo, and non-horse riders, which is the soldiers of Dahomey, was somehow exaggerated, since by the 19th century, the horse had been adopted as significant markers of status and wealth, and also into the various armies by many ethnic groups in West Africa, as Robin Law instructs us in The Horse in West African History. The horse was also a mixed military blessing, as it was not very useful in highly forested areas, which was one of the reasons why the Oyos were defeated by Dahomey. The Kingdom of Dahomey was a formidable power from about the 1720s, when, with the conquest of the key coastal kingdoms of Alada and Ouida, they became a major hub in the transatlantic slave trade. The British blockade to stop slavery in the 1850s led to the kingdom's progressive demise. As might be recalled from our episode from last week, the coast of Alada was where the British drew on slaves for the building of James Fort in Accra in 1672, which indicates that Alada had been central to slave trading for several centuries before it was stopped. War between Dahomey and France from 1892 did further damage to the kingdom. The French finally defeated Dahomey in 1900 by changing their tactics in close combat. They introduced longer knives on their handheld guns, which led to a major shift of advantage in their favor when it came to hand-to-hand combat with the formidable Agoji army. The famed Benin bronzes were looted from Dahomey during France's final successful invasion, and the current controversies surrounding their possible repatriation from different parts of the world back to Dahomey is testament to the old kingdom's continuing resonance in the popular imagination. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.